Hello and welcome to the first episode of 10 Years of Bad Self-Help. This is going to be a podcast-style talk series exploring various ideas about self-help, productivity, personal growth, and therapy. Imagine this, you're diving into some content that makes bold promises about incredible results. It could be a self-help book, an online course, a success coach, or a new therapist, and it all sounds very promising, but is it too good to be true? There's always a cost to finding out. Perhaps they want you to commit to a 1-month trial or a set number of paid sessions. They might even acknowledge that you won't see concrete results within just a few months, while still assuring you that your dreams are all but inevitable if you only persist with their methods. How do you go about making an informed decision in this situation without already being an expert, having access to a trusted person who's tried that exact same thing, trying to read every review on the internet, or just biting the bullet and trying it yourself? In this series, I'm going to show you how to spot telltale signs of effective and ineffective educators, and especially bad ideas that kind of seem plausible at first glance. I'll be approaching things from a neurodiversity perspective, encouraging you to learn what's right for your brain and body. It doesn't matter what works for other people, what matters is what works for you. This first episode is about privilege being an invisible factor that plays a huge role in our lives, and especially when pursuing personal growth or success. For those of you with time or attention constraints, I'm going to start with the take-home message up front. Valid advice can often become bad or harmful when it doesn't consider the relative privilege of the listener. When advice assumes a highly privileged context, it raises a common red flag that I call undisclosed privilege. To a disprivileged listener, the author seems to credit their success to insight or method when it's predominantly just privilege at play. Privilege has a lot of heavy implications that you might have never thought of before, so stick around as we dive right in. Let's start with a definition. Privilege is the unearned advantages, benefits, and opportunities that an individual gets within a society and that not everyone gets. We often talk about privileges relating to class, gender, race, sexual orientation, and ability. Everyone has both privileges and lack of privileges, or disadvantages. Technically, there's a grey area about classifying whether something is a privilege or not, depending on how we subjectively interpret whether the advantage is earned. If you went to the trouble of buying lotto tickets and you ended up winning the jackpot, did you earn the benefit of being a multimillionaire? Well, putting this philosophy question aside, we're going to end up expanding the concept of privilege beyond the literal definition as we go on. I want to point out two canonical observations about having privilege. Firstly, privilege is often characteristically invisible to people who have it. For example, if a kid is sent to school every day without lunch, they are disprivileged. Maybe their classmates don't notice. Let's say their teacher notices and decides to simply bring an extra lunch set every day for the kid. This hypothetical teacher is a bit old-schooled, so they think, well, problem solved, the kid's not going hungry anymore, at least not on my watch. But this would be a deeply flawed conclusion, because even if the nutritional aspect of the disprivilege is addressed, the kid is still likely to have, for example, feelings of shame or embarrassment, maybe a general sense that they aren't important, that they deserve less than other kids, or can't rely on their parents, potentially leading to low self-esteem and social withdrawal, which could then further affect the quality of their experience at school and beyond. It is simply very difficult for the teacher to be aware of the total cumulative disprivilege, despite being aware of the initial nutritional disprivilege. Explaining this concept to the teacher might simply not be enough. By acknowledging the potential cumulative effects, you can already see that I'm expanding the concept of privilege beyond purely initial unearned privilege or disadvantage. The second observation is that privilege begets more privilege, and likewise, disadvantages can lead to further disadvantages. There's a video online that draws attention to privilege in a really concrete way. I recommend watching that, and you can find it by searching for the $100 race. Quick note here. Acknowledging privilege has got nothing to do with shrugging off responsibility. Whatever hand we get dealt with in life, being aware of privilege allows us to discover our blind spots, reduce cognitive distortions and biases, make more informed decisions, and connect better with others from different backgrounds. I also think that, similar to personality traits, privilege isn't beneficial in every single situation, nor is it harmful in every single situation. It largely depends on the world we live in and on the environment we're in. We can't easily change the first one, but we can have some agency on the second. So that's enough theory for now. Let's look at a positive example of privilege-aware teaching. This comes from a book that completely changed my life 10 years ago and that I've reread since multiple times. It's called Running on Empty: Overcome Your Childhood Emotional Neglect. This gets a green flag for privilege awareness for the following reasons. The subject matter itself is already about lack of privilege, the disprivilege of experiencing childhood emotional neglect. And this is linked to symptoms of low self-esteem, poor emotional regulation, feeling empty and disconnected, and like an alien by the time you're an adult. The very first page of the introduction is already acknowledging that the reader may be disprivileged. It leans towards simple language and simple examples to highlight important ideas. Despite emotionally heavy topics, the writing, especially in Chapter 2, is just so remarkably easy to read and understand. I found it pleasing to read almost on that basis alone. The book doesn't contain any fluff or sales pitches, and can be read from start to finish in about 5 hours. In terms of the didactic structure, there are several other green flags present. Importantly, the book includes all of the key ingredients for a theory of change, which includes the following elements. 1. An acknowledgement of where the reader may be starting out from. 2. The concrete steps that can be taken to improve one's situation. 3. The reason for taking those specific steps. 4. The probable experience of taking those steps. 5. The long-term desired outcome of taking those steps. 6. The proposed pathways of change that explain how taking those steps leads to the desired outcome. 7. Assumptions about this process or the necessary conditions for success. And finally, 8. What can be done if things aren't working? I find it valuable to have all of these things present because it almost amounts to having first-order feedback. If something goes wrong when you try the process, you can check back against this list to see whether one or more of these aspects is misaligned with your actual experience. But if the author fails to present one or more of these elements, it's that much harder to know why and what, if anything goes wrong. The book also talks about the nature of progress and doesn't portray progress in an unrealistic way. The book is also transparent about whether the stories are real or fictional, where its ideas come from, meaning you can fact check it, and its epistemic status. For example, it acknowledges that the questionnaire presented at the start has not been psychometrically validated and that the ideas in this book are relatively emergent as opposed to well established. Although the book does have some weaknesses, I don't presently recall any red flags. On this note, what would it even mean if a content source appears to be ideal, with no red, orange, or yellow flags at all, and every green flag that exists? Well, it doesn't mean that the content will work for you, but it likely suggests that the author tried to give you the best tools that they could, within that medium, to test for yourself whether the content does work for you. And if you want to be sure, you probably still do need to try it for yourself, not just run thought experiments about it. But when you try it, the author has already given you pseudo-interactive feedback and guidance. This means that the cost of you trying out is reduced. You don't have to guess what the author means, what concrete actions you actually need to take, or whether you're on the right track at all. The material would also be somewhat self-sufficient. It might still encourage you to seek professional guidance simultaneously, but that's not because the author deliberately or unwittingly left out important information. Even if it turns out that the method doesn't work for you, that's not really a failure. You'll have learned something about yourself with high confidence and relatively low investment. And this same conclusion is not so clear when you try out low-quality sources that don't work for you. Learning what doesn't apply to you is an important part of the journey to finding out what does. Now, looping back to privilege, we all have different sets of privileges and abilities, where we don't exactly fit on one hierarchy. There are many, many dimensions, and general comparisons are usually going to be incredibly fuzzy. But in some contexts, such as relating to specific skills or mastery, privilege does kind of collapse into fewer dimensions. I'm going to overgeneralize for this next example. Don't take it too literally because things aren't always so black and white. So, you can kind of see a hierarchical progression of the following privileges. If you fundamentally believe in your value as a human being, regardless of anything you do or don't do, then you have the possibility of practicing healthy self-care. If you practice healthy self-care, you have the possibility of habitually listening to your feelings. If you habitually listen to your feelings, you have the possibility of understanding those feelings. Understanding those feelings can lead to healthy emotional regulation, which can lead to understanding yourself as a whole, which can lead to making decisions that work with your head, heart, and body, then being resilient when things go wrong, developing confidence in your problem solving, expanding your comfort zone over time, and ultimately, the ability to thrive in stressful, high-reward environments. Privileges can be manually acquired, and in some vague sense, personal growth expands the set of privileges available to you, such as by highlighting possibilities that would otherwise never have crossed your mind. Some privileges, in practice, will never be undone, unlearned, fully healed, or overcome. When manual learning is required, a lot of the significant privileges along the journey of personal growth require months, years, or decades, and we're not even talking about mastery or anything, more like being able to juggle this thing when you pay attention to it, but sometimes dropping the ball when you're multitasking. The ladder of privilege I just cited consists of 11 rungs. Someone who was born and raised into enough privileges, by the time they're about 20 years old, they might be starting their adult life on the middle rung of the ladder, way ahead of adults with childhood trauma, who might not have even made it onto the lowest rung of the ladder, which, believe me, is not uncommon at all. Notice how, if you don't acknowledge the ladder of privilege, it is ridiculously easy to condense good advice into bad advice. For example, it's logically valid to suggest that a person who is deeply upset may have the option of regulating their emotions. But if you just say, just regulate your emotions, move on and get on with it, well, it sort of makes sense to someone at the top of the ladder, but it's also redundant and not insightful. Say the same thing to someone low on the privilege ladder, someone who doesn't know about the ladder, and now what you're saying makes no sense whatsoever. It's like you're being condescending, but also, emotional regulation sounds like a myth sold by people who actually have to process their emotions, and I'm perfectly fine just repressing everything without realizing. Like, what are you even talking about? I didn't state this earlier, but not only are privileged people unaware of disprivilege, also, disprivileged people often have no idea what it's like to not be disprivileged, especially when it comes to how your brain or body operates. If you were born deaf, you can't really form an accurate impression of how your everyday life would have felt otherwise. If your brain is wired to be anxious and overthink everything, you can't comprehend what it's like for some people to just do important stuff without thinking about it. Let's take a step back now. Have a breather. How does what I've said so far sit with you? I hope this hasn't been boring at least, but there is actually a subtle issue with everything I've explained so far using privilege, besides the definition. Can you tell what it is? Feel free to hit pause right now if you're up for this as an intellectual challenge. Here's a hint, it has something to do with me talking too abstractly. If you spotted it or felt it intuitively, I'm impressed and I suspect that you're quite an astute listener. So here's the issue. Nothing I've said so far needed to be explained using privilege. I could have just said these three things. Great educators can ideally adapt to all skill levels. Mastery of advanced skills often requires competency in less advanced skills, and transparency about learning curves is beneficial. A simple reason for invoking the concept of privilege is that privilege has an appropriately fuzzier meaning, because skill hierarchies probably don't exist in such a black and white, singular way, like with my ladder example. I would like to now distill the abstract ideas around privilege into something you can apply more concretely. Let's look at an example. Disclaimer here, I know very little about golf, so I apologize in advance if this isn't up to par. If you had a child who was wheelchair bound, and they really wanted to start playing golf and also become really good at it, how might you go about trying to make that happen? Wheelchair golf is a real thing, and so ideally, I would want to find a coach who specializes in wheelchair golf, or at least has taught a couple of students with a similar disability. That might be quite unlikely depending on where you live, so next I would consider a golf coach who is at least open to trying to teach my kid. But there might be a better option, like working with a physiotherapist who specializes in physical disabilities. The physio doesn't even need to have experience in golf, just a willingness to experiment and maybe learn some of the basics about golf. If my child were to succeed, the way they end up playing golf is going to look different, which means their path getting there would also be different. Whoever is taking on the role of their coach, I suspect that being attuned to my child's ability and disability is going to be way more significant than the coach's personal prowess at golf or wheelchair golf. Here's a thematically similar example. If you're neurodivergent and have an interest-based nervous system, which is mostly associated with ADHD and potentially also autism, and you want to significantly improve your productivity, in my opinion, you're much more likely to succeed by working with a practitioner, coach, or mentor who is neurodivergent themselves or specifically works with neurodivergent clients. That probably narrows down your pool of in-person options to less than 5%, so I do recommend having a look at online options. Advice that is overly rigid is basically always privileged. And of course, privilege is not universal. For example, dating advice that tells you to do a specific activity on a first date might be excellent for one demographic within a particular country, while being incredibly bad for other countries or age groups. Advice that's structured like, people are doing this thing isn't as good as they think it is, and they should be doing less of it, is kind of instantly in orange or red flag territory for me. I find that when a book or article uses generalizations like this, it's almost always an example of a red flag that I call social posturing, which won't be covered in this episode. Putting aside the condescending tone, if you think that the advice is reasonable and that some people need to hear it, note that you could reverse the advice to its opposite and it would still ring true for some demographic. People are doing this thing, it's better than they think it is, but they should be doing more of it. I'm not saying that advice can't be insightful just because it has red flags, but that a more honest way to communicate the same ideas is by acknowledging assumptions or personalizing the statements. A bigger improvement yet would be to understand the core insights and how they apply after removing the initial assumptions. The tone of the advice might shift towards something more like, here are the pros and cons, and here are some suggestions for figuring out whether you might benefit by doing more or less of it, based on what you value personally. Here's an interesting thought. All else being equal, neurodivergent-friendly coaching is inherently more robust than neurotypical coaching because it requires a more expansive understanding. For example, I've heard an observation from an ADHD coach and others online that neurotypical productivity tips usually don't work for ADHDers, but ADHD productivity tips often do work for neurotypicals. My hypothesis for understanding this is that, although there are many different flavor variations of ADHD, at least some of those flavors roughly lie along specific dimensions of certain privileges that apply to everyone. For example, it might be related to your brain's dopamine profile when you want to be doing something because it's important, even though it's not particularly pleasant. If you think back to the concept of the privilege ladder, neurotypicals are simply sitting higher on the ladder, so it makes sense that ADHD advice could be game-changing for those at lower privilege, while being mildly beneficial to those with slightly higher but not extremely high privilege. If you're neurodivergent, you're probably also painfully aware that neurotypicals often aren't that interested in accommodating or understanding us. I'll note a few more parallels between neurotype privilege and privilege in general. Most doctors, teachers, success coaches, productivity experts, world champions probably don't know much about neurodiversity. Neurodiversity awareness, like privilege awareness, is not a default thing that most people have. Privilege awareness is like a distinct ability in itself, or at least a large subset within a specific topic. Being knowledgeable about one type of privilege doesn't make you automatically knowledgeable about other types either. As with neurodiversity, privilege awareness probably comes about either through lived experience of disprivilege and/or spending a lot of time with disprivileged people with an openness to learning from them. When privileged people with low awareness see disprivileged people not being able to perform the same way as them, there's a tendency to attribute the difference in performance to character flaws, as opposed to the disprivileged having different needs for reasons outside of their control. This is like neurotypical people telling ADHDers that they're lazy and they could just do things if they actually wanted to and tried. Stated more simply, privileged individuals are prone to giving ableist advice, even when they have sincere intentions. A really sad example is how neurotypicals are more likely to be casually ableist, not really caring, but some of the most passionately violent ableism you'll come across is from undiagnosed, high-masking autistic individuals unwittingly trying to deny and set themselves above unmasked autistic disprivilege. As a disprivileged person, it's quite a normal arc to start off in earlier life being too open-minded and naively believing that other people have things figured out and that when advice doesn't work, it must be you that's the problem. As you learn more about yourself, it is actually beneficial to be less open-minded about certain things, like what kind of friendships work for you and your tolerance for discomfort versus potential reward. This is one of the many ways in which healthy boundaries can be at play. Suppose you're doing a course which you paid $300 to have access to. Everything was going great to start with, and the kind of success it promises to deliver definitely seems to align with what you want. But then, halfway through, they pull a huge twist on you and it basically amounts to, you can be just as successful as we promise if you set aside judgment and be okay with scamming people. Hopefully, you decide that you're not okay with that, even if you believed that scamming people really could get you those results. And maybe you feel disappointed, so you approach the course facilitator and you say, I'm not happy about this, I'm not willing to scam people, but the content has otherwise been pretty good. Surely you can give me some ways to succeed that don't involve scamming. Now, we're definitely in grifter territory, so the facilitator says, well, we could give you other ways, but the other ways are slower. We don't teach them because we don't want to limit you. This course is for people who are open-minded and thirsty for success. You are the only one limiting yourself. I don't have time to delve into all of the red flags here, so I'll just leave you with something to ponder on this one. The process of discovering and knowing yourself might seem and feel like it limits your potential, but it doesn't. Those who suggest otherwise are often attempting to diminish your needs and boundaries. Let me share with you my personal conclusion about seeking advice from neurotypical experts. This is purely subjective and what makes sense in the context of my own life. I spent many years being excessively open-minded, and it didn't always serve me well. I'm often too optimistic and naively trusting towards people who can't and don't want to acknowledge my needs as a unique individual. That unearned trust has come with my vulnerability and my disappointment. Having gone through many such cycles of trust and disappointment, my empirical experience points to the following kind of dichotomy. When people are marketing themselves and their services, the kind of people who can and want to accommodate across disprivileges tend to present that up front. I don't have to guess or read between the lines. I often don't even have to ask, because they don't randomly get disprivileged clients unless they're open and public about it. If I do ask, anything that feels less than a heck yes from both them and me is a yellow or orange flag for me, especially when neurotypicals can be quite comfortable with bullshitting. Unfortunately, misrepresenting one's abilities often isn't a big deal in neurotypical speak because it's somewhat normal, everyone does it, and other neurotypicals can understand when words aren't meant to be interpreted as literal truth. Great teaching is already a rare skill. Privilege-aware teaching is an even rarer subset of that. When someone markets themselves using all the messages and norms of neurotypical thinking, and not a single concrete sign of making neurodiverse-aware accommodations, it makes zero sense whatsoever for me to think that they would be able to tailor their expertise and feedback in a way that meets my neurodivergent needs. It's not impossible, but the chances are really, really low, and I've been gradually trying to update my boundaries to reflect that, given that every time I invest in a possibility, it's often quite an all-in experience, even if I don't intend it to be, with my emotional regulation and nervous system regulation being invariably at stake. So I encourage you to think about your boundaries around privilege, or even just in general. What are the things that need to be a heck yes for you, but you haven't enforced it, and you've suffered a lot of hurt and disappointment as a result? How have things panned out for you when you let in people who are in the murky waters of not being privilege aware, but seemingly willing to learn? To be clear, boundaries are not permanent fixtures. You can change, add, move, or remove them however you want. I've spent long enough in murky waters to know that doesn't suit me in the context of personal growth. It might be okay for you, and it might be okay and not okay for you in different contexts and stages of your life. People who are privileged in a certain context don't tend to need as many accommodations to succeed on an everyday scale. If you are listening to this and you feel like you might be on the higher end of the privilege scale, I still do have some notes for you, especially if you're pursuing big dreams. You might have faster progress spending time around people who are also privileged. It still helps to be cautious around extremely privileged people who may mistake privilege and luck-based success as universal wisdom. If you want to be supportive towards disprivileged friends, colleagues, family, or partners, please do me a favor and listen to them first without jumping to unsolicited advice. This episode turned out to be a whole lot more theoretical than I first imagined, but undisclosed privilege and related flags are so rampant that they'll probably pop up in every episode, so I did want to introduce this concept first, for ease of future reference. As we're approaching the end, let me summarize a few key points from this episode. 1. Valid advice can become bad or harmful when it doesn't account for the relative privilege of the listener. 2. Undisclosed privilege is a common red flag. 3. The intersection of expertise, good teaching, and awareness of privilege is relatively uncommon. 4. Authors who aren't aware of privilege may be prone to crediting their success to wisdom and expertise rather than luck or privilege. I want to share a few personal things with you for transparency's sake. I had very different plans for this first episode initially, but suddenly this idea about the disprivileged listener emerged from my subconscious. I was like, what the heck, this is big if true, but is it even true? I have two simultaneous reactions about my own thoughts. On one hand, I'm like, whoa, this is really profound, and it took my subconscious decades to compute. And on the other, I'm like, well, despite the fact that I hadn't realized this before, isn't it actually really obvious when you think about it? Like, so obvious it's basically redundant and doesn't mean anything insightful? Or could it be that I didn't have the privilege of understanding this earlier in life, and now I do, and yet the higher privilege would be to never have had any reason to realize this? Either way, it was a fun exploration for me. I hope you enjoyed it too, and I'm going to let it sit for a while. But I'd be really curious to hear your reaction and thoughts on it, or if you know of any authors or works that talk about privilege in a similar way. Feel free to leave me a comment, or if you have long-form thoughts on this that you're happy to share with me, I would love to hear them, and you can contact me by email or on other platforms. Shameless plug for my neurodivergent memes on Instagram, which I'm super proud of. One last thing. You might be curious about the title of this series. Let me share that with you. It's been roughly 10 years since I came across my first self-help book that was actually good, the one I used earlier as an example. And along this 10-year journey, I've tried many different things, including counseling, therapy, coaching, being a mentor and a mentee, personal development, books, conferences, and so on. I've spent well over $10,000 on these things because I believe that investing in myself is worthwhile in the long run. I've been through many memorable highs and lows. In case you're wondering why the series doesn't just focus on what works, for one thing, I'm still very much figuring that out for myself. I have been slowly drafting frameworks of my own, but it's been under 2 years since discovering that I'm neurodivergent, specifically autistic, and along with the complex and winding journey of unmasking my neurotype, I'm having to re-evaluate everything I thought I knew about psychology from a different lens. While there's still so much I feel the need to unlearn and relearn, based on all the things I've tried in the last 10 years, well, boy do I know a whole lot about what doesn't work. Making this series is a part of my journey. It's going to be messy and uncertain, highly imperfect. I don't know what I'm going to discover in my own brain, in what order, or how I'm going to present it. I happen to be very interested in the art of good teaching, so as we explore red flags, green flags, and different ways to assess didactic communication, I have a hunch that we might be able to build an understanding that can be applied to pretty much any genre of educational content, not just self-help. And I would love to, for example, come up with a semi-objective framework for grading self-help books along all the important dimensions of effective transfer of knowledge. Making the series is a form of processing and self-expression for me, with my intuition telling me that it will be quite a healing journey. And although I'm doing this for me, on my own terms, if there is a chance that, in sharing this journey with others, I might reduce the hurt and suffering that others experience, maybe shorten the time it takes for you to find the right things in your life, that would be priceless to me. Thank you for listening to my rambling, and I hope to have the privilege of speaking to you again.